Today our objective is to explain the political, intellectual, artistic, economic, and religious impact of the Reformation. What exactly was the Reformation? The Reformation was a 16th century religious revolution. It changed or did away with some Catholic teachings, and it created Protestant churches. The Reformation was started by a monk named Martin Luther. The Catholic Church had become very corrupt over the years. It had been essentially running society, running Europe for hundreds of years. And over this time, the clergy and the priests had become very rich, and the church even more so. They began doing things like selling indulgences, meaning that you would have to pay to be forgiven by God, and the priest would give you that forgiveness if you paid a certain amount. Martin Luther rebelled against these ideas and started essentially a revolution that continues to change the world even today. Because it was a religious revolution, obviously it had a big religious impact. What was the religious impact of the Reformation? Probably the biggest thing you should remember from this is that the unity of Europe was shattered. Remember, as the Roman Empire fell, people began to unify under the church. And even though they may not be part of an empire or part of a country, they could at least take heart in the fact that they shared beliefs with one another, and they were all part of the Christian church. However, this was completely broken apart by the Reformation as people began to draw lines between Protestant and Catholic. And they would refer to themselves as Protestant or Catholic, and it created division and quite a bit of conflict for many years. The Bible was translated into what we call the vernacular. Before, the Bible had been written in Latin and in Greek, and people would really need to find out from the priests or the clergy what the Bible was saying, because they didn't read Latin or Greek. By translating the Bible into the vernacular, people began to discover the Bible for themselves, to read the Bible themselves, and it really meant that ordinary people could access God without the need for going to the priest. Of course, all of these changes brought about also a Catholic counter-reformation. They recognized themselves that things needed to change, and they did change some things. They also started an Inquisition court that was established to punish anybody who went against the teachings of the church. And they also banned quite a few books that they considered to be heretical. Most of those were Protestant books that were banned by the Catholic Church in the Counter-Reformation. There was also a political impact of the Reformation. The biggest point to remember here is that it greatly increased the power of secular rulers. So kings, queens, princes, anyone who was in the high position of government suddenly became much more powerful after the Reformation. Europe became politically fragmented. Countries would basically come down on the lines again of Protestant versus Catholic. Spain and France became Catholic countries, while England became a Protestant country. The Holy Roman Empire, which had ruled much of the European territory for many years, became much weaker again as parts of the territory, parts of the empire began to choose between Catholic or Protestant. Henry VIII of England became the head of the Anglican Church. As I mentioned, England went to the Protestant side. The Anglican Church was created, and then as King of England, Henry VIII also became king or head of the church. And again, this meant that the state becomes much more powerful than the church after the Reformation. In addition to the religious and political impacts of the Reformation, there were also artistic, intellectual, and economic impacts. In the world of art, before the Reformation, art tended to be focused on Christ or the saints or clergy, the priests, the church. However, after the Reformation, art included common people and became much more lifelike. For example, this artwork is from before the Reformation. As you can see, it's the Madonna and the Christ child and several saints. You see lots of halos. It's a very two-dimensional, since Mary and Christ are the two most important figures in the painting. The other figures are smaller, even though that's not lifelike. Now, after the Reformation, art began to look more like this, where you see here it's much more lifelike. This is actually Jesus Christ here calling the tax collector Matthew. And back here in the background we see buildings and people. These people existed in the real world, and there was an attempt at realism. And so a big change, again, between this style of art to this style, before and after the Reformation. There was also an intellectual impact of the Reformation. A lot of expanded educational opportunities. When Martin Luther finished a lot of his protesting to create the Protestant church, he also established Lutheranism, or the Lutheran Church. And under the authority of the Lutheran Church, education was opened up to many men and women during this time. The printing press was invented and continued to be improved, and that meant that religious ideas of the Reformation could spread much more quickly through Europe when paper and books and flyers could be printed instead of hand copied like they used to be before the printing press. Finally, there was a much increase in individualism. People began to think more for themselves. People began to worry about making their own personal life better. So we have a growth of individualism. Finally, economic impacts of the Reformation include a strengthening of a middle class. You began to have people, merchants especially, who would not be the very rich like nobility, but neither were they peasants. People like you and me began to come into being with a middle class. And then finally, the very beginnings of the economic system of capitalism, the system that we operate under today, began as a result of the Reformation.